A lot of good conversation going. What I thought we'd do is we'll move it on a little bit because we want to leave enough time for Q&A. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to think about this now. You've had the opportunity to chew on it. I hope you chew on it more. I hope you have a chance to get the book, and I hope you have a chance to really chew on this because, in a sense, the whole book is there. So I want to leave you with these things. First of all, every economic decision we make is a moral choice. Remember that. That's true of individuals, it's true of businesses, it's true of government. Every economic decision we make is a moral choice. Secondly, the capitalism we have is the capitalism we have chosen. So therefore, logically, if we'd like to see it redeemed, we need to make different choices. There are no quick fixes, really important. A lot of people want immediate results. It took us generations to get here. We're not going to get out of it overnight. We defer to legislation when ethics fail. Government is not the solution here. It's a backstop. It's a safeguard. It's a guardrail. There is no substitute for ethics. There is no recipe for the attainment of virtue. It is forged in the crucible of practice. These quotations, by the way, because they're all quotations from the book. It's forged in the crucible of practice. You don't teach virtue. You do virtuous things. Redeeming capitalism is not a project, it's a mission, which means it takes faith, it takes time, it takes perseverance. The book, as I say, is a how-to book, not a can-do book. I give lots of examples in the book, but it's not a manifesto for a movement. If it was a manifesto for a movement, I'd say do these 12 steps or let's demand these 10 things from government or whatever. It's not what we're talking about. It's a credo for a community of like-minded people who believe that God can do impossible things and who believe it's worth, against great odds, redeeming capitalism. And it's a journey, not a destination. But if, like the Israelites, we follow the teachings, values, and commands that have been provided and the common ground for a values-based culture, we can escape the desert of postmodern capitalism and let those principles pave the way to a new economic promised land. That's the concept of the book. I hope you have found today useful. Most of all, I hope you found it challenging. I really do. I hope it kind of unsettled you a little bit. It made you think, have I really even thought about this in the context of my work, in the context of my business, in the context of economic policy and discussions? Remember, we used to call economics political economy. That's not partisanship. That's the polis. That's the governance that takes place. So you can't avoid the two. So we have a congressman here. Let's hold his feet to the fire. He would love it. He would love it. He would love it. And he's an economist. He knows what I'm talking about. Government's not the solution. Government's not the solution. God is the solution. Goodwill is the solution. Faith, hope, and love are the solution. Thank you very much. We're going to have a time of Q&A.
So we have time for 3 or 4 questions, perhaps. First one right there. Yes, ma'am.
Right behind you. My name's Tricia Dunlap. I would like to know your thoughts on the movement toward corporate social responsibility and also a subset of business known as B Corps or benefit corporations. That can be a challenging model. My company is a B Corp, and it can be hard. So I'd like to know your thoughts on how they could play a role in this larger movement.
Yeah, that's a great question. So corporate social responsibility is great, but it's a little bit like ISO. It becomes a box-ticking exercise. And it's an effort to institutionalize something which has to be organic. That's the key to this. It's got to be real. It's got to come from the hearts and the minds of the people who really want to make a difference. Not that there's anything wrong with corporate social responsibility. I'd rather have that than have nothing. But again, it's not a substitute. I think B Corps are great. I think social enterprises are great. At Said Business School in Oxford, we had the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. So people came from all over the world to learn about social entrepreneurship. Now, the only problem with that is, shouldn't every business be socially minded as well? Why do we have to have a separate category for social entrepreneurship? These aren't nonprofit organizations. These are for-profit businesses that see themselves as having a particular social function. Again, I'd rather have that than not have it. But something even better is all businesses seek the common good. So if you come away with nothing else, I hope you understand that this is not an either-or situation. People can make money. People can succeed. People can create wealth. People can do well. There will be inequalities in the system. And we can still have an economic system that provides for human flourishing. That's the key. It's not an either-or.
Over here. I'm sorry. Follow up? Oh, Farnaz.
I'd like an explanation of the parable in Luke 16 of the shrewd servant who
Okay.
learns that his master is about to lay him off for good cause and then cancels everyone's debts. I'd just love an explanation from a theologian.
You know what? That is such an interesting passage of Scripture, and almost everybody gets it wrong, in my opinion. I've heard people say, oh, well, Jesus is just being pragmatic. Jesus was condoning somehow the work of the bad servant. He wasn't. Read what the passage says. He says to them, if you want to dwell in the houses of the rich or the houses of the worldly, do as they do. Well, when I was a kid, I grew up in New York. If my father saw me hanging out on the street corner with wise guys, you know what he'd say to me? Hey, you like hanging out with those guys? Keep hanging out with them, and you'll get 20 to 30 years with them. Jesus is being ironic in Luke 16. Jesus is being ironic. He's saying, yeah, you'll dwell with the wicked forever. And we all know where the wicked dwell. He's being ironic because clearly the good steward serves the master. It's a very complex passage, but if you allow yourself to think of it in those terms, it's like the scales fall off and you go, of course. And here's the thing. As a biblical scholar, Jesus is at times ironic. Jesus is at times sarcastic. Jesus is at times funny. Okay? Jesus was human. And because he's Jesus, we sometimes read everything as though it were a serious statement without any humanity behind it. There's tremendous. When Jesus says, right, don't pick the splinter in your neighbor's eye until you deal with the log in your own, he was being facetious. He was being funny. And if you don't believe me, tell that story to a 5-year-old. They'll laugh hysterically. A log! So Luke 16 is a great example of what not to do. Thank you for asking that. Let me put my theological hat on.
One here. Doug? Doug, there's a microphone.
You defined the word socialism, and I wouldn't normally ask anyone to define capitalism because people roll their eyes. But since you defined socialism, could you define capitalism? And
Yeah,
also,
as I said earlier.
do you have problems with the word itself as a Christian?
No, I think the word is fine. As I said earlier, capitalism is nothing more than the word we use to describe the phenomenon of economics done in a highly monetized, lightly regulated free market. That's all capitalism is. That's why I say it's a subject, not an object. No one invented capitalism. It is not a construct at all. Socialism is a construct. Marxism is a construct. Capitalism isn't. Capitalism evolved over time. It evolved out of the mercantile system. And the mercantile system evolved out of the medieval guild system, and on, and you keep going back as far back as you want to go. So that's why it's hard to define it, because it doesn't have hypostasis. So we define it as a subject, not an object. I hope that was clear. Yes?
Jim, and then this lady here.
Hello?
Yeah.
For 30 years, I represented management in labor negotiations.
Jim, would you stand up, please?
Yes, I'm sorry. Representing management in labor negotiations. This concept of justice and fairness, somehow my idea of what was fair in contract language, the union didn't share my opinion. Could you give us some benchmarks, elements of fairness? What is a yardstick that we ought to look at to determine whether or not an element or a decision is fair?
Okay. The first benchmark is the golden rule. That's the first benchmark. Put yourself in their position. Turn the tables. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you would happily live with what you're proposing, it's probably fair. That's the first benchmark. The other thing I would say about labor negotiations is, unfortunately, they've become adversarial. And this is part of the problem. I talk in the book about, can we go from contractual thinking to covenantal thinking? Covenantal thinking is a biblical concept where there is mutual interdependence. And it doesn't presume violation, it presumes obedience. Whereas in contractual relations, there is a presumption, if you will, that someone's going to break the contract. So once it becomes adversarial, I win, you lose, we immediately start to lose the very virtues we're trying to develop. Now, it's interesting. I mentioned before that I worked for Steelcase, right? So Steelcase is a manufacturer of office furniture in the largest union state in the country, right? Michigan, because of the automotive industry. And guess what? We bent steel and painted steel just like the automotive. We didn't have a single union in any of our factories, not one. Because there was a relationship between management and workers, and there was also a profit-sharing plan that management volunteered with the workers so that workers got bonuses based on the profitability of the company. Now, some people thought Steelcase was crazy, but Steelcase became by far the largest manufacturer in the sector. And people loved working there, and there were sometimes 2 and 3 generations working there, and there was never a union. There was never even a vote for a union. So, just the fact that we're in those adversarial situations is difficult. Let me say something about the living wage. This is an HR issue that's hot right now. I don't believe it's the government's responsibility to impose the living wage, but I believe in the living wage. I believe, as Adam Smith said, that if companies willingly took slightly lower profits in order to ensure that everyone who worked for the company got at least slightly more than that which was necessary for subsistence, it would not only be the right thing to do, it would be in the long-term interest of the company, because everyone would benefit. But I want to see companies make that decision. I don't want to see governments make that decision. Because, as I said, we only defer to legislation when ethics fail. So that's, and by the way, when slavery was eradicated in 1811 in Britain and its colonies, and its holdings, who did they appeal to argue the economic argument for ending slavery? Adam Smith. Adam Smith. And in fact, slavery hurt the American economy because we weren't involving everyone in the system. It wasn't until after we abolished slavery that everybody started to participate in the system that we actually start to see the economic miracle of America in the late 19th, early 20th century. So good wages, Henry Ford said this, good wages isn't charity, good wages is good business. Henry Ford said that. So I hope that helps.
Yes, ma'am.
My husband and I have homeschooled for a long time, and now we are working with a group that is empowering tomorrow's professionals in a Christ-centered arts and technology community. And we just saw that the Barna Research Group says the church has got to begin to mentor and disciple young people in the marketplace, as far as entering the marketplace. What would you advise us to do?
Boy, I'll tell you what, thank you for that question. Because this is not only something we should be doing in our businesses. Folks, this is the single biggest missed opportunity in the church today, in my opinion. We have got a huge reservoir of wisdom and experience in mostly retired or semi-retired people in our churches who want to feel useful and who don't like coming to church and feel like they're ghettoized with other people their age. Oh, would you like to join the bridge club or whatever? They want to be useful, right? And we say we want to reach millennials. Ask the millennials in the back. You know what the millennials want more than anything? Mentoring. They want mentoring. Why aren't we taking this resource we have in our churches and putting it together with the people we want to attract to our churches and say, one of the benefits of being part of our community is you get the benefit of the wisdom and the experience of these people who are going to give their time to you. What an opportunity for evangelism. What an opportunity for discipleship. It is, and I know this because I was a chaplain for 10 years at Oxford University. I didn't just teach there. And for 10 years, these students came to me regularly and said, please find us mentors. We go to lectures all the time. We get lectures till we're going, batty. We want mentors. So you have to be purposeful about it, but it's absolutely fundamental. And I hope you go back to your churches and you say, why aren't we taking advantage of this resource?
David?
Yeah, do I have to stand up? All right, that's good.
And be counted.
You can help me with my Democrat colleagues. First of all, I think that is the most important project the world has to deal with, redeeming capitalism.
Thank you,
Emphasis on redemption. And yesterday you started off in good Calvinist lingo, going from common grace to the spiritual virtues, etc. So I'll just tee it up. I work out every morning with all the Democrats. Juan Vargas, trained Jesuit, real smart, great guy. And I'll just show you how hard it is to go even to get in the common grace piece up there. So Juan will lecture me, well, Dave, on immigration, says in the scripture, you got to take care of the sojourner and the wanderer and all that. I said, oh, very good, Juan. You Jesuits learn something. So that's good. I said, where exactly does it say that? He scratched his head for a little bit. I said, I think that's in the Hebrew scripture, right? And I said, I think when they were commanding that to the people, it was a theocracy. And so I said, so if you're asking me to command the American people to take care of the sojourner, and if you think I have the authority to do that, I'm interested in that proposition. That's cool, right? So this is the move from common grace. I said, and then on education policy, same thing. I said, can we teach, Juan, he's a Democrat, but we're good friends. I said, can we teach the theological virtues in public school? No. He said, that's the challenge we have on our hands. So the hard piece is the capitalism, I think we could deal, but the redemption piece, how do we do that? There's kind of a split in the country. Folks are very reluctant to let the theological virtues into the public square at all. I mean, and this is a Jesuit, right? I mean, we're buddies. He's highly educated, and there is a wall for them. And so how do we make that move from common grace to the faith, hope, and love that ultimately probably are required to get that to happen?
Sure. First of all, if you want to really understand where he comes from, if you haven't done it, read some Catholic social teaching. There's some excellent Catholic social teaching on this. And I don't agree with the suggestion that we can't teach the theological virtues in school. We can. You weren't here earlier when I was talking about the fact that faith, hope, and love are universal. We call them theological because we acknowledge their source. But you can't have an economic system without faith. Faith in something bigger than yourself, whatever it might be. Any of you ever been through a 12-step program? You know one of the first things, right, of a 12-step program is that you need to acknowledge some power beyond you. We can have that discussion. We can talk about hope. We talk about hope a lot. And we can have that conversation in the public schools. And love. Again, the problem when we talk about love is we talk about this mawkish emotion. Whereas the notion of love as selflessness is something we absolutely can talk about. So I think we need to have some guts. I think we need to stand up and say, wait a minute, we're not talking theology here. We're not talking doctrine here. We're not trying to proselytize anyone. What we're saying is that these universal virtues are being lost, and we need to reclaim them, and it's in everyone's best interest that we do reclaim them. So, you know, if there's a little bit of a struggle in the beginning, that goes back to courage. Right? Have the willingness to oppose that which opposes virtue itself. That's what courage is. So we need to have the courage to say, we're going to stand up for these things. And I think what happens is, as I said earlier, that virtue is forged in the crucible of practice. We also know, by the way, from the biological sciences, that when we do virtuous things, our body produces something called oxytocin. And it makes us crave more virtuous things. And that is a scientific fact. I talk about it in the book. So if we start down the road gets easier the more we do these things. Great question. Thank you. And thank you for your comments about the book.
Time for, we have two hands. These will be the last two. This one up first. And Stephen, you'll close us out.
You mentioned profit sharing. I'm sure there are other kind of tools like that a business can voluntarily make to sort of involve the workers in the capitalist enterprise. Why don't we see more of that? Are there institutional or regulatory obstacles standing in the way, or is it just collective
Well, actually, we
stupidity?
are seeing more of it. It's growing. A lot of these things are growing. Impact investment is growing. Employee ownership is growing. Profit sharing is growing. One of the nice things about writing the book when I wrote it is that there's already a little bit of critical mass. And so I'm sort of riding that wave, and I'm saying, let's keep this thing going. There is a lot of it. And again, you know, it's a question of will. And companies can do it. And if, look, at the end of the day, maximizing shareholder value is an important metric. There's a fiduciary responsibility. But the one thing we have in our favor is no one has defined the time frames. No one has defined the time frames. And if we can make a business case for doing the right thing and it will have the long-term benefit to the shareholder, we are on safe ground. If we are just doing charitable things because as Christians we think we should do that, and it's a publicly traded company, then we're in danger of moral hazard. But if we can make a good business case, and in many cases we can, in fact, in almost all cases we can, for the fact that this is in the shareholders' best interest because it's in the other stakeholders' best interests, we can do these things. And there is a legislative opportunity here, by the way. In the UK, they changed what's called the Companies Act in 2006, which relieved executives, directors of companies, from only considering shareholder value and in ensuring that they consider all stakeholders in every decision they make, freeing them to consider not just immediate shareholder value, but what's in the best interest of the community, the workers, the supply chain, etc. And what that does, it still puts the shareholders in a position of primus inter pares, first among equals, but it does allow for this kind of thinking. And I've seen marvelous things done. I have seen, as an example, businesses that if you just took a short-term, you know, what's the NPV? What's the net present value of closing a factory? And someone says the NPV is 1.2. So everyone goes, oh, close the factory. But you can say, wait a minute, if we make other changes, if we invest in technology, if we do various improvements, etc., we can stay right where we are. We don't have to move the factory. And the NPV might be 2.5, but it's still a very reasonable NPV. And in the long run, we haven't had all the disruption, all the risk, all the things that come along with, you know, damage to goodwill, etc. So if companies want to do virtuous things, there are absolutely legal and fiduciary responsible ways of doing it. It's a great question.
I think we have a question here, but then Stephen, hold your hand up, please. Jordan, that'll be the last question. So we have two more.
Hi. I just want to make a comment about or ask you a question about kind of a macro level issue. You started out at the macro level and sort of brought it down, and I really do think that it's a challenge to each one of us individually as Christians to go be salt and light, and that's what's going to make the difference ultimately. But I do believe that at the macro level, you talked about Lehman Brothers and all these big corporations, you can codify ethics there too to make a difference. And just to, before I ask you the question, just to prove the point, Sarbanes-Oxley made a big difference, for example, in terms of requiring outside board members who don't have financial interests, and that has restored a lot of confidence in investing in stocks and so forth. Off-balance sheet transactions that were allowed before Enron, and then after Enron, they said, no, you have to record your off-balance sheet transactions. So those kinds of changes make a big difference. So the thing that bothers me right now, though, that I'm getting to, and that I think we could do something about, is this cozy relationship between legislators and big corporate executives. And the thing that really bothers me is the lobbying that happens as people go to Washington, then they turn around, they go make mega bucks lobbying. And so when they're in Washington, they go lightly on the big corporations. For example, there have been so many cases where corporations have been busted, but they never admit or deny any wrongdoing. They pay millions of dollars.
Let me just stop you there if I may, only because you're getting to an area that I can't speak to. What you're saying is absolutely relevant. Let me answer the first question, if I may, because that is exactly an area I can speak to. And that is, you mentioned two areas where legislation helped improve a situation. Both times it was retrospective. And so we do need legislation to give us guardrails, but legislation is always one pace behind the crooks. What I'm saying is we defer to legislation when ethics fail. We get guardrails when things happen that we should have anticipated and should have controlled. I'm being proactive. I'm saying let's create an environment where we won't have to have that kind of legislation because people won't do those things because the cultures of the companies will find it impossible. The second thing that you're talking about, however, this relationship between companies and policymakers, I don't mention that in the book. That's the next book, Redeeming Democracy. So you're going to have to wait for the next book.
I want to thank you for coming. It's been a great
Thank you. It's my joy.
In regards to companies taking on moral standpoints in recent, I mean, we watched the whole Hobby Lobby thing. We watched Chick-fil-A. We watched companies that tried to operate from a moral standpoint get lambasted in the public square and almost put out of business. But yet and still you have these huge corporations like Apple and Google who are now taking stands. How is it, as a believer, how do we navigate that? I mean, they're taking moral stands as if they're actually individuals. They've moved from, whether it be Nike or whatever, they've moved from being corporations to taking on really powerful platforms.
I would say that if Christians are being ridiculed, you're doing the right things. It's the story of Jesus. Amen. We should be comfortable in the margins. We should be comfortable in the margins. You know, what Jesus preached was countercultural. I'm okay with that. I think the church should be okay with being countercultural. And part of the courage is to stand up even when they're going to ridicule us. But guess what? We have an effect. We have an effect. And sooner or later, the critical mass is on our side. So I would say keep doing it. Don't worry about the ridicule. Have the courage. Be salt and light. Speak the truth in love. And leave the results to God. One of the wonderful things about being a Calvinist is we always leave the results to God. Thank you.